Welcome again, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Maria Julia Oliva, and I'm Deputy Director of UEBT, one of the organizers of this webinar. Now, UEBT has been working on access and benefit sharing for many years now, and the most common request that we get when we talk about ABS are, please share with us practical cases, actual cases, not perfect cases, but cases in situations that happen in real life. And that's why I'm so excited to be here with you today to present to you the outcomes of this project that looks at very real life cases, none of them simple, but all of them very interesting, and all of them that show how ABS can contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals. This was a project supported by the German Federal Agency for Nature Conservation and the German Federal Ministry for the Environment, Nature Conservation and Nuclear Safety. The project was undertaken by UEBT, GeoMedia, and the Institute for Biodiversity Network. So this was a really interesting collaboration, and I hope you enjoy hearing about the results today. So we're gonna be together for an hour and 45 minutes today. If we can have the slide with the agenda, please. After some opening remarks by BFN, my colleague Valerie will outline the project, what its objective was, what the cases we looked at, and what some of the findings of the project were. And then we're going to have a panel discussion involving the people that were actually involved in these cases, or at least the organizations that were involved in these cases. So 3 selected cases, and we'll hear more about these cases later. And lastly, we're very pleased to have Takuo Shikondo from the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Secretariat there. He's in charge of issues linked to access and benefit sharing, and he's going to share with us some concluding remarks at the end of the webinar. A few housekeeping points. We are going to be taking questions using the Q&A function. So we're not going to have the chat open because it goes by very fast and it's hard to get the questions. So please, if you want to have questions, we absolutely welcome that. Use the Q&A function, and we will be recording this webinar, and the webinar will be shared with all of the participants. So just so you know, you don't have to frantically take notes. So with that, I am going to give the floor over to Clara Nestvogel. She's Nagoya Protocol Compliance Officer at BFN, the German Federal Agency for Nature Conservation, which is, of course, the competent national authority for the Nagoya Protocol in Germany, and one of the organizations that supported this project, as well as many other activities advancing the implementation on ABS. Clara, I'm going to ask you to please turn on your camera, and please, we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much, Julia, for your kind introduction, and good afternoon from Germany, colleagues. It's a great pleasure to be with you this afternoon and to say a few welcoming words on behalf of the German Federal Agency for Nature Conservation, or in short, the BFN. As you all probably already know, Germany is a party to the Nagoya Protocol since 2016. While Germany itself is not regulating access to its genetic resources and related benefit sharing, the compliance measures foreseen under the Nagoya Protocol are thoroughly implemented through the EU ABS regulation. BFN is the competent national authority for implementing the EU ABS regulation and its compliance checks in Germany, which means that we are checking German users of genetic resources in view of their compliance with the ABS rules of provider countries. In addition to the compliance checks, BFN has undertaken a number of projects in the past 5 years. For example, organizing ABS dialogues with provider countries about their ABS processes, workshops with EU competent authorities to exchange experiences with the implementation of the EU ABS regulation and its compliance checks, hosting an international workshop with the CBD Secretariat on international compliance monitoring, several trainings for German research and industrial sectors, and lately an ABS support platform for the basic research community, which is called the Nagoya Protocol Hub. All these projects show our commitment to make implementation of the Nagoya Protocol and the broader ABS approach a success. And this project we are talking about today on ABS cases and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Maybe we can have the slide on the compendium here. Thank you very much. The compendium, which is launched today, is another important project that Germany funded in order to support ABS implementation and practice. The objective of this project was to showcase that ABS can work in practice, what benefits are at stake beyond the pure monetary side, what challenges exist, but equally the opportunities in view of achieving the SDGs. So in short, we wanted to investigate ABS success stories and not only ABS failures. Since 2018, we have undertaken 83 compliance checks, both in different industrial sectors and in the basic research community in Germany, meaning research institutes and universities. And while we have already detected a few cases of non-compliance, we've also seen how important it is to do ABS awareness raising and capacity building and to show how it can become success stories. In the absolute majority of cases, commercial as well as non-commercial researchers have a great interest in being compliant with ABS rules of provider countries of genetic resources, but far too many are still struggling for various reasons. We see the challenges the researchers are facing under the bilateral ABS system of the Nagoya Protocol, which suffers from lack of standardization and complexity, and still far too often lack of legal clarity, which is the starting point of ABS compliance. As a consequence, BFN is working on different ABS fronts, so to say. The compliance checks on the one side, but also awareness raising, capacity building, and user support as important pillars of ABS compliance on the other side. Compliance checks are necessary, but we cannot check compliance by everyone, and this wouldn't be cost efficient either. Only through parallel pathways, compliance, and support for a real paradigm shift, we can tap the full potential of ABS beyond further ABS negotiations and any different interpretations of Nagoya Protocol scope issues. For us, one of the most important outcomes of this project is to show that this paradigm shift actually is occurring in more and more companies and research institutions, not only in Germany, but around the world. To conclude, I would like to thank the project partners, GeoMedia, UEBT, and IBN for their great research leading to this very interesting and hopefully inspiring compendium of ABS success stories. I would also like to thank the CBD Secretariat as well as other presenters and colleagues who are joining us today for this launch and interesting discussions. So to come to an end, let's hope that in another 10 years from now, we will have hundreds or more new ABS success stories to celebrate as important contributions to the UN SDGs, as well as the future global biodiversity framework. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Clara. Thank you very much for these opening remarks and for your support through this project. My name is Valérie Normand. I will now have the pleasure to present to you some of the key findings of this project. I work for UEBT as a senior ABS expert. So if we can please go to the next slide. So I won't mention what was already said. So I'm happy to present to you, as I just said, some key outcomes of the project, which was carried out over about a year and a half by UEBT, GeoMedia, and the Institute for Biodiversity Network. Now, a first output of this project was already shared on the occasion of the 10th anniversary of the Nagoya Protocol in October of last year. You will remember there was a global conference to celebrate this event. And on that occasion, we made available a handout, which is really an overview of the 20 cases that are covered by the project. So today we are very happy now to present to you the final results of the project, which are included in the compendium of which you just saw the cover page. And this compendium includes 11 of the 20 cases, and it looks in more detail at these 11 cases. And it also includes an analysis of key findings from lessons learned across the across the 20 cases covered by the project, and also looks at what were the key contributions of ABS to the SDGs across these projects. So I take this opportunity actually right now at the start to thank very much all of those who were involved in preparing these case studies, and that is people in countries, people from companies, from research institutions who provided information, shared information, were very generous with their time also in revising the draft case study. So I take this opportunity to thank you very much. Okay, if we can please go to the next slide. So now just to provide you a bit of context to this project. So the broader context to the project is that it was prepared in light of the preparations, or rather the development of this post-2020 global biodiversity framework, which is to be adopted at COP15, as you all know, which has now been postponed to next fall. So that's why the project was initiated, in order to provide input in the preparations of this post-2020 framework, and to look at more particularly, of course, what are practical ABS cases of implementation, and looking at how ABS contributes to the SDGs, given that, of course, ABS will be a key component of the post-2020 framework, and the post-2020 framework is meant to contribute to the implementation of the SDGs. So coming back now to the issue of access and benefit sharing, in terms of where we're at. As you know, we now have 130 countries which have ratified the Nagoya Protocol, with Brazil being the latest country to have ratified only a few weeks ago. And we know that although 130 countries have ratified, many of these countries are still working on developing national ABS measures or revising existing measures in order to be in line with the protocol. So as we were looking for cases to include in this project, it was difficult to identify cases from which we could draw lessons which had already implemented the Nagoya Protocol, if you see what I mean. So many of the cases in the project are cases which started before the Nagoya Protocol was adopted, which involved sometimes ABS measures which were adopted to address access and benefit sharing provisions under the CBD, which are sometimes in some countries currently being revised to be in line with the new Nagoya Protocol obligations. Some of the cases involve countries that are parties to the Nagoya Protocol but do not yet have ABS measures in place. And some other cases involve countries which have ABS measures in place but are not yet parties to the Nagoya Protocol. So there are a variety of situations reflected in these cases, but these were all interesting cases, we thought, to be able to draw lessons with respect to ABS implementation. So that's why they were chosen. Next slide, please. Okay, so basically in terms of the selection of the 20 cases, what we did is we tried to identify cases which, where we could illustrate the use of different types of genetic resources. So from plants, trees, plant compounds, berries, flowers, marine biological resources, fungi. So we try to include a diversity of use of different types of genetic resources, which were used for either purely scientific purposes as part of research projects, for instance, or for commercial use, for instance, for the development of cosmetics or medical treatments. The countries where the genetic resources were accessed in these cases are from Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And in a minute, I'll show you what some of these countries are. And basically what we did for each of the 20 cases is we examined what is the story behind the access and benefit sharing partnership. So for instance, if it was a case where genetic resources were accessed for scientific purposes, we generally provide background on what was the scientific project behind it. Or if it's genetic resources accessed for commercial purposes, why were these genetic resources accessed? In what broader context? Was it for the supply of raw material, for the development of cosmetic products, or for the development of pharmaceuticals, that type of thing? For each of the cases, we also examined or identified who are the key actors involved. So who is the resource provider? Who is the competent authority in the provider country? Who is the user or the users, because in many cases there is more than one user. And also who are the national collaborators who are working on the ABS case or involved in the ABS case, or who were the facilitators involved. Also, for each case, we examined what were the ABS elements. So how was prior informed consent obtained? How were mutually agreed terms negotiated? And very importantly, all of the cases highlight what were monetary and non-monetary benefits from these cases. And also, on all of these cases, we look at what this particular case, what lessons learned could be drawn from this particular case, and what were the contributions of this particular case to the SDGs. Next slide, please. So here on this slide, you see the countries from which resources were accessed in the 11 cases which are covered by the compendium. So as you see, there are countries in Latin America, in Africa, and in Asia. And I will go to the next slide, please. Okay, so now we will go to, I would like to present to you what were some of the key lessons learned from the cases. And starting with general lessons learned. And I think it's important to start with that because basically some of the key conclusions drawn from these cases is that ABS, as we all know, involves a shift in mindset and practices and behaviors. And this takes time. And it takes time, particularly in countries, and in many of these cases that we were looking at, where the ABS cases were the first steps in implementing ABS in a country, or the first time that a user was meeting ABS requirements in a particular country. So it involved the time needed for the users to familiarize themselves with the access requirements in the country, for providers to understand what access and benefit sharing is about sometimes, and to establish mutual understanding between providers and users. Also, as I mentioned earlier, many of the cases we looked at were at early stages of implementation. But what was very interesting in terms of lesson learned from all of this is that the process that was followed, which in many cases was a lengthy process, really did enable the establishment of strong relationships between users and providers. And it highlighted the importance of communication and dialogue to contribute to building a climate of trust between users and providers. Next slide, please. Okay, so now going to some of the good practices we felt emerge from the lessons learned across the 12 cases. And so I don't have that much time left, so I will not go into the detail of each one of these slides, but all of these information can, of course, be found in the compendium, and this presentation will also be made available to you. So in terms of good practices with respect to ABS legal and policy frameworks, first of all, I would like to highlight the important role that can be played at national or subnational level by the development of a national policy or strategy which supports the valorization of biodiversity and traditional knowledge, and also supports the development of national research capacity. And this is something that we saw, for instance, in one of the cases, which is the case of the state of Sarawak in Malaysia. So I won't give you any more information, but you may want to have a particular look at this case. But there are also other cases in the compendium which illustrate the importance of such a national policy or strategy involving the valorization of biodiversity. Now, in terms of the development of clear, simple, and transparent ABS measures, a number of elements came out as we were working on the cases. So one of them is, of course, the importance of involving relevant stakeholders in the development of ABS measures. And relevant stakeholders are, of course, providers, so communities that are providers of resources, for instance, and also users of genetic resources who have particular needs and constraints in terms of time and transaction costs, for instance. Another important finding was the usefulness of establishing transitional measures to regularize access activities. And this is something that was raised, for instance, in the case which takes place in Colombia. And in Colombia, they have established procedures for regularization of access to genetic resources, which have proven to be very useful. Brazil has done the same. So again, this is one aspect of ABS measures which is found very useful. It's in particular in the beginning when ABS measures are being implemented in a country. One other interesting point that was raised is the fact that it's useful for users to be able to obtain research permits for bioprospecting in a particular area of a diversity of genetic resources or of numerous genetic resources in a particular area, rather than have to ask for individual access for each access to genetic resources. Online application processes are also found to be very useful and will become so more and more, in particular in these days and time of COVID. And of course, as we already know, and this is nothing new to the ABS discussion, simplified processes and standardized procedures for academic research is something that in general, researchers are really hoping for. Now, if we can go to the next slide. Now, in terms of supportive mechanisms to consider, so I'll only highlight a few here because we're running short of time. So the involvement of intermediaries has proven very useful in supporting ABS implementation. Now, these intermediaries can be national collaborators, and in many countries, you need to have a national collaborator when you're accessing genetic resources in a country, so they can play a useful role in helping to navigate ABS procedures, in understanding the national context, in facilitating relationship between the provider and the user. And this role can also be played by neutral facilitators in the country or outside the country. Another important point is the key role that can be played by the use of voluntary tools, such as guidelines and codes of conduct that are developed by user groups, such as, for instance, botanical gardens, research institutions, and we'll hear in the panel discussion that's coming more about certainly the guidelines that were developed, for instance, by Kew Gardens. I imagine that is one issue that will be addressed. And of course, as you see on the slide, the development of community protocols, investing time in communication and dialogue, and raising awareness to access and benefit sharing, which is a continuous issue that needs to be addressed, are also important elements to support ABS implementation. And now the last slide on good practices relate to benefit sharing. Now, I think one of the key outcomes of this project was really to highlight the the importance, the key importance of non-monetary benefits in ABS arrangements. And we saw in a number of these ABS cases how the sharing of know-how, technology transfer, capacity building have contributed to conservation and sustainable use, to the development of national research capacities, and to the livelihood of communities. So that is really one key outcome of this project. I would just briefly mention two other things. What is important to users in many cases is to know what the benefits are used for and how they contribute to conservation and sustainable use. And finally, with respect to benefit sharing, what was demonstrated also in a number of cases is the usefulness of establishing a benefit sharing fund, and we'll hear more about that in the panel discussion. And benefit sharing funds can be particularly useful in cases which involve relationships with indigenous or local communities so that they can take part in the decision-making process. Okay, so now moving to the contribution of ABS to the Sustainable Development Goals. You have these on this slide and on the next slide. I just want to indicate here, and I won't go into any detail on these slides, that basically ABS contributes to a number of SDGs through benefit sharing, through monetary benefits, but I would say most importantly through non-monetary benefits that contribute to training, capacity building, development of new skills. These all contribute to improving the livelihoods of communities, to sustainable economic growth, and also to the development of national scientific research capacities and to infrastructure development. And the last slide on the contribution of ABS to the SDGs. So basically SDG 15 is the one that is most directly related to biodiversity. And again, these cases have demonstrated how ABS can contribute to raising awareness about biodiversity, preserving and restoring biodiversity, and also building capacity on sustainable use and the management of forests. That was the situation also in several cases, sustainable use and the management of forests. And finally, just to say that ABS cases rarely involved only one provider and one user. They involve many stakeholders oftentimes, and therefore they're a very good illustration of collaboration between South-South actors and North-South actors, and contribute therefore to SDG 17. Okay, so now, this last slide was to illustrate that some of these cases also contributed to additional SDGs, which you see on the slide. So now I will move to questions, and we have about 5 minutes for questions before we move to the panel discussion, or a bit more than that. Okay, and I see that there is a good question here, which relates to transitional measures to regularize access activities. Yes, so this is a very good question, and thank you, because I didn't have time to elaborate on that. So, for instance, in some countries, once access measures enter into force, they enable users of genetic resources which accessed resources in the past to regularize access, in other words, to obtain prior informed consent and to negotiate mutually agreed terms, including the sharing of benefits. So they help support compliance with ABS requirements by users who may have accessed genetic resources without knowing that there were ABS requirements in place, or before these ABS requirements were established. So I hope this answers the question. Now, are there other questions?
Sorry, maybe Valerie, there was a question that I did answer in writing, but in terms of a couple of points about how we selected the cases, and also whether there are any of these cases provided the best example. So if you have any thoughts on or anything you want to share on those 2 points.
Yes, thank you, Julia. I think that's a good point. No, unfortunately, this is the thing. There is no best example. It's all about learning by doing, and it's all about the particular circumstances of a situation where the genetic resources, in which countries the resources are accessed, by which user, involving which providers. So of course, there are general lessons learned that can apply to different cases, but there is no one perfect case. And what was interesting in these cases was, I think, precisely the fact that they were not perfect. They were complex, they were challenging at times, and they were lengthy processes because both the users and providers had to go through the motions of understanding what ABS implementation was about and what was the best solution in the end. And the great thing is, I think good solutions were found in the end, which enabled the establishment of strong partnerships, strong relationships, which will hopefully continue over time. Yes, I think there's an important comment here, actually, which refers to the fact that often we consider SDGs as separate boxes. And it's important to consider them as a connected set. And I think this is actually very relevant in this particular case, because as I was just mentioning on these last 2 slides, what we can see is that ABS, through benefit sharing, contributes to many of the SDGs at once. So, and it is those same non-monetary benefits that contribute to these various SDGs. So I do think that it demonstrates that ABS contributes to sustainable development more broadly if it's properly implemented.
If we have time, Valerie, if you could maybe address the issue of cases selection, because I see another question asking why there are no ABS cases from northern countries, let's say.
Yes, so well, we tried to include a variety of cases. Basically, it was not easy to find ABS cases, and more particularly to find information on ABS cases. So we didn't aim to exclude access to genetic resources from countries from the north in particular. But the cases that we chose, we thought were helpful in drawing lessons learned. And probably many of the countries that had ABS measures for the longest time were those in provider countries, in developing countries. And the way we selected the studies is basically we reached out to our networks, to ABS focal points, to users that were involved in access and benefit sharing, and tried to identify the cases where we had most information and where we could draw some useful lessons. Okay.
If we still have time, Valerie, there's another question about some common aspects of the cases, whether there's any.
Yes, well, definitely, I think a common element is the role of non-monetary benefits, which really came out strongly. And this is in terms of building capacity when the cases involve relationship with, for instance, provider communities, that capacity building training in harvesting techniques, how to conserve resources, how all of this has contributed to conservation and sustainable use, and also importantly to the livelihood of communities by by training for the development of new skills in communities, and increasing their awareness of the value of their biodiversity and their traditional knowledge also. Okay.
Should I throw a couple more questions at you, Valerie, or let me know?
Yeah, actually, based on my my timing, I think we should be moving on to the panel discussion. But
okay, we'll try to answer the questions as much as possible in writing then.
Okay, but I can perhaps answer one or two more. I think we have maybe 2 more minutes for questions.
There's a question, for instance, about dealing with confidentiality issues in talking about ABS and sharing cases on ABS.
Yes, indeed. No, of course, the issue of business confidentiality, we very much respected the willingness of users. Often they are the ones who have confidentiality issues and cannot share all the details of a particular case. So of course, we respected that. But they were quite generous with the information that they shared. And we made available as much information as we could find and was made available to us for the different cases. But of course, confidentiality is always an issue. Okay. So I think now is the time to move on to the panel. Yes, okay. And now I am pleased to introduce you to Suhail Al-Janabi, who is the Managing Director of GeoMedia. And Suhail will be moderating the panel discussion, which will involve discussions on 3 cases which were covered by the project. So Suhail, if you are ready, I invite you to turn on your camera, to unmute, and I will give you the floor.
Thank you, Valerie, and I hope I'm visible now. Okay. Thank you all attendees to this webinar, and yes, we're entering now the part of the panel discussion where we will have a closer look at 3 of the cases. Unfortunately, we will not be able to present all of them in detail, but this is exactly, of course, where the compendium is good for, and what hopefully makes you also curious to look into those case studies, which, if you read them, also some of the questions that have been raised now in the chat will be answered. Thank you, Valerie, in the first place, now to summarize the findings of the study. And well, I would like to invite you now to come with me on a journey to 3 countries with ABS partnerships. And here I'm proud to talk to practitioners and regulators about lessons learned and also good practices from the ground. Next slide. So our journey starts close. It starts in the Middle East, and here we do look into a project researching biodiversity to preserve traditional diets and wild plants in the Middle East. Activities here include seed conservation, cultivation, trainings, and research on the nutritional quality and also on seed germination. This project supports the sustainable use of the studied plants by local people, the preservation of traditional knowledge and food security in the region. And you can see that it does contribute as a research project to a couple of SDGs, including poverty alleviation, zero hunger, even climate action, and as Valerie pointed out, quite importantly, partnerships for achieving the SDGs, the goals. Next one. The journey will continue to look at the domestic case to Brazil, where the company of Natura, developed a long-term partnership with communities that are extracting from the Amazon for the development of a couple of cosmetic products. And Natura has worked with these communities in the Amazon region to establish supply chains, sustainable supply chains for Andiroba and Murumuru butter. And these are interesting properties for the use of the development in cosmetic products. And here we will find out more shortly. And finally, next slide, we'll arrive in South Africa. And this case is to investigate into a long-term ABS partnership with indigenous communities for a pharmaceutical product to treat bronchitis. And here we will explore how the commercial use of Pelargonium sidoides delivers impact on a couple of SDGs, as you see, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 15, and 17. And next slide. Here I'm really happy to have all our panelists that are, as I said, practitioners coming from the regulatory side, from the sourcing side, from the research side, and I will introduce them then one by one, as I'll call them.
Like I said, I think the points which makes such a thing successful is the engagement with the communities. From my actual experience, I can say it's a long-term process, and you need to be patient with everything. As I told you, my experience are not so
long-standing here.
Not so long-standing, but what I can, if you would ask me in a year or two, I could tell you a little bit more. Yeah, I mean, what I can see from now is things are sometimes a little more complex, and but a good approach is to get in touch directly, like I did now with Letitia and the other people from the Department of Forestry and Fishery in South Africa, and things for me things are getting clearer and more transparent, and yeah, I appreciate this.
Okay, thanks, Philip. So what I get out of what you're saying is sometimes it takes long, but it's also worthwhile to directly engage with also as an end user with the regulators and communities on the spot, and that yeah, things become clearer as longer as you get acquainted with the case, the regulators, and the institutional landscape. I would like to shift to Lactitia. And the Pelargonium case, Lactitia is accompanying you for a long time, or probably rather the other way around. You are accompanying the Pelargonium case. Over all these years, what lessons do you draw from particularly that case?
Thank you very much, Sohail. Indeed, the Pelargonium case is actually accompanying me because I think I found it in the space. And I would also like to thank the organizing team for this opportunity to share our experience in this case from a government perspective. And just to indicate that we are participating here as the provider country, just to come to the CBD language, and we are also a regulator. So what I can share with you in terms of the lessons that I could draw from this case, and I'm glad that I've actually spent some time. I think it's almost over a decade working on this Pelargonium project. And thanks, Philip, for acknowledging our recent engagement, because Pelargonium case is not going anywhere. We are still going to have it even in this coming decade. So the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment, we learned about this project or this case before the entry into force of our national ABS measures. And I think, Sohail, you've touched on it, it's true. The Pelargonium case started long before we could even become a party to the CBD. And I think as a department, it actually started to appear in our system 2 years before the entry into force of our ABS system. And for it to start to appear in our system, I think it's also important for me or for us to acknowledge the role that was played by the partners in this case through the local partner Perceval. I think we started to have engagement even before our ABS system entered into force. But and with that process, it made the Pelargonium case to form part of the very first group of applications that were received, which actually contributed in the first phase of the implementation of the ABS system in South Africa. Earlier on during Valerie's presentation, I think there was a question about the transitional arrangement. So this Pelargonium case, it was part of those projects that were affected by the transitional arrangement introduced in our ABS system. So they were given 6 months from the entry into force of the legislation to put together the permit application documentation and submit them to the issuing authority for consideration so that they can be aligned to the ABS principles. But again, I think another important point to note was that even before the ABS system was effective in the country, the industry was always following the provincial system that was already in place, but it was only focusing on the harvesting and the collection of the resources, and they were doing that in collaboration with the local communities based on what the provincial legislation or framework provides in terms of the necessary permits that are required for collection or harvesting from the world. So now coming to the ABS elements of this project, because I think it's important to also share with you what transpired after everything was done and aligned to the ABS principle, and some of the lessons that I could draw from this project regarding the transparency at the regulatory level. And I'm saying that because at that level, you need to now make available your ABS requirements. If there are forms that needs to be completed, so they need to be made available to the relevant affected industries and the communities. And for us, I know right at the beginning, some of this information were just available, but through the lessons that we've learned in the implementation and the the very first phase of these regulations, we were now able to see a need to have this kind of system available in our departmental website. We also, when the ABS clearinghouse system was established, we were ready to, and we've already seen a need to have such kind of information available out there. And I think after 3 years of implementing the regulations, we then move on and put together some guidelines trying to provide more simplified interpretation of the regulations so that the industries and the other communities can easily navigate the system. And we've also developed step-by-step process just to help the industries and the communities to understand the various steps and the processes that needs to be followed. Another important aspect that we've drawn out of this process was also regarding the transparency at the community level, because with ABS, there's more emphasis about the involvement of the communities who are the custodians of the resources or the genetic resources that are being targeted or utilized for this kind of activities. So in this case, what we have done, we were able to conduct engagement to ensure that the relevant communities understand the ABS project itself in partnership with Perseval as the local partner that was representing Swabe in the project. So we walked together the journey of engaging with the communities to get them to understand what is needed and the necessary agreements that were required for this project. So it was quite a long process, as Philip indicated. Yes, it took us quite a long to get everything sorted for this project. And another important point to also share with you was the fact that in the absence of the biocultural community protocol, the one that is provided in terms of the Nagoya Protocol on ABS, in this case, through the existing customary system of the relevant communities that are involved in this case, we were able to negotiate, they were able to negotiate and conclude benefit sharing and identify the traditional council leaders to sign the relevant agreements on behalf of the entire communities. And maybe lastly, and most important also to share with you is regarding the role of the department in this entire case. The department has a dual role as a national competent authority. Our role was to regulate ABS, but also because we are also the national focal point, we also assumed the role of providing guidance and also facilitate the engagement with the relevant stakeholders. Thank you.
Thanks, Letitia. But this underlines also what China has said, that there's a lot of learning by doing, and that also feedback, practical feedback from the ground, then also can be picked up in the development of further regulations and processes and standards. So we're really talking about learning systems here at both ends. So I think that's a very important lesson. I would like now to go into round two, and this is a bit more on the impacts. Many of you have already alluded to those, but looking at the CBD and the three objectives, of course, let's say in the first place, and also as the objective of the Nagoya Protocol says, ABS should contribute to conservation and sustainable use. Khaled, maybe briefly, in Jordan, the ABS partnership, to what extent has it contributed to that, to better management, conservation, sustainable use, maybe in one or two sentences?
Thank you very much. It contributed to conserve, as I mentioned before, a large part of our flora, the very diverse flora of Jordan, as well as contributed to inspire the way of conservation of in situ and ex situ as complementary processes. In addition to that, it contributed and helped in, as I mentioned before, doing scientific products out of the collection of material, different analysis and different publications. Mutual publications has been were a product of the collaboration. As general, it gave a general view on how to use how to sustainably utilize the flora and the genetic resources as general.
Okay, so really a contribution to knowledge management, to on treating, but also on taxonomy. China, but there is of course also the aspect of traditional use. I mean, you worked on traditional use, and on the other hand, of course, could you also then provide some support to, let's say, the preservation of TK in the region?
Yeah, so with this project, the traditional knowledge about the use of the edible plants was collected by our partners and on behalf of our partners, and also stored. So we have created, we've jointly with partners compiled databases, and at the moment those databases are just held and used internally between and for the partnership as really decision-making tools, so that we can look at gap analysis, we can look at where things are growing, where things, and so they're kind of used for decision-making tools within the partnership. So the next, you know, if we get a renewal of this project, we're looking for funding at the moment, then we hope that there will more be done with that information, but that needs to be discussed between the partners, and it's them that have been collecting and working with communities to look at how that will be shared. So that the next stage of the project will, I think, be more move on to the partners and communities.
So you have picked up on that and made, so to speak, a first step, but it could be part and parcel the TK aspect in a follow-up project.
Yeah, exactly.
Thanks a lot. Kevin, from the Natura experience, and you were mentioning the fund, and usually when talking about funds, we talk about money. We may also think about consumptive goods and let's say social and economic development. But this fund, did it also contribute to, besides livelihoods, also to aspects of conservation and sustainable use in the sense of the convention?
Yeah, for sure. Because by the end, although the main focus is try to contribute to the forest preservation and conservation, I think that we could succeed beyond that. So I can give some examples about it. So I think one of them, of course, is try to create some jobs and, of course, increase the family income. How we can try to support the entrepreneurship of the local communities. How we can empower the local people. How we can improve the local infrastructures. How we can give and enhance environmental educations, and of course, enhancement supply chains beyond of the raw materials that we are purchasing. So I think that, and of course, as I mentioned and highlighted before in the first round, how we can try to contribute by gender equity. So I think that are the main keys that we could have as an outcome of the fund. But more than that, I think that when we are doing the distributions of the benefit sharing via the implementation of some projects that are selected by calls, that are selected by the three parties, the business, the government, and the communities, what we can see is not only the sense referring to transparency, but more than that, how we can try to decentralize the applications of the investments and the payments on the benefit sharing, and try to amplify the investments in the communities, going a little bit beyond on the supply chains that we are directly purchasing.
Okay, thanks a lot. And we will have, of course, a question and answer session where then participants can also ask these questions in the chat. That's why I have to hurry a little bit now and want to give now Uli Feiter from Parseval the floor. And I wouldn't say you are sitting between the chairs of the regulators, the local community on the one hand and the user on the other hand, but you do have a linking function as a sourcer. And in that regard, you were also supporting then all the discussions on the benefit sharing setups, how this could then be, the benefits could be invested. And it was not only on conservation and sustainable use, but we do see that there are also contributions to other SDGs like education, which I find quite interesting in the Pelargonium case. So maybe you can say some words about that.
Yeah, thank you for giving me the floor for this. It's actually quite interesting. I've been involved personally with the Pelargonium since about 1995, and that was long before the Nagoya Protocol. It was in the beginning of the CBD, etc., and also long before the implementation of the National Environmental Management Biodiversity Act in South Africa. And it was clear from a very early stage that it was important to engage with the communities and to give something back in a real exchange and a fair exchange. When the regulations came in 2008, we started engaging with the department. We started to engage more formally with communities. And as was said earlier on, and in many instances, it was a case of learning by doing. You try something out, you see whether it works, and what works you continue with, and what does not work you kind of drop, or you try to improve on. So we've gone, our engagement with the communities and the benefit sharing has actually gone through a number of mutations. And I would think to the better. What also happened in parallel on the side of Schwabe is that the will to share benefits and to engage in Africa, also beyond South Africa, actually led to the formation of a foundation in Germany, the Umkaloabo Foundation. And the foundation legislation in Germany also very clearly, you have to state the purpose of your foundation. And after some deliberations, it was decided to make a focus on education, because that is, as we all know, an investment into the future. And that is, of course, completely independent of investment into sustainability, etc. So, but the Umkaloabo Foundation has got a very strong focus on fostering education, of development of youth, etc. So we started to look for projects, and also that went through a number of mutations and changes and evolution. And we at the moment we actually quite comfortable with how we operate. By now we also have Parseval has got its own foundation, the Samara Foundation, to which we actually channel these kind of activities. And between the Umkaloabo Foundation in Germany and Samara Foundation in South Africa, we channel the funds and we discuss where to invest. And then obviously we engage with the communities where we are operating. And most often we find ourselves being engaged with early childhood development centers, which are especially in the rural areas of South Africa, very neglected in terms of infrastructure, also training and skills of the personnel looking after the children. So it's a very resource poor situation, and to some extent it's quite easy to make an impact there. You must imagine if one goes into these communities, an early childhood development center consists of a physical structure and often not much else. No infrastructure, no toilets, no books, no chairs, no furniture, nothing. So we get involved on that level and improve that, but we also provide training and educational training and also personal development training to the teachers.
Thanks, Uli. I know that there are many aspects to talk about. And what I really find interesting about that case, and this is also what Valerie was introducing in the beginning, is that there are a lot of spin-offs, non-monetary spin-offs that these cases can trigger. And maybe very shortly, Laetitia, to you about spin-offs from that case. There are working groups like the Pelargonium working group that have been established, and also biodiversity management plans or a plan where was a result of that. Maybe you can say just 2 or 3 words on what this case has triggered, let's say, really in the surrounding.
Okay, thank you very much, Suhail. Yeah, indeed, there's a lot of benefits that we can talk about from a Pelargonium case. Indeed, it had an element of conservation as part of its benefits commitments, where a resource assessment was conducted. And this resource assessment actually contributed into the development of the management plan for these species. And this plan, its aim was to ensure the long-term survival of the species in the wild. I think that's basically why there was a need for that plan to be put in place, while also ensuring that the livelihoods of the communities are respected. So if you go through that plan that was developed for this species, you'll be able to come across some of these objectives. And again, it also introduced the monitoring and the control system just to strengthen the existing system of the authority in terms of monitoring the population of the species in the wild. So those are some of the good initiatives that came out of this project. And of course, there is a Pelargonium working group, which is a multi-stakeholder platform where industry, government, conservation agencies, and communities come together and discuss various matters relating to the Pelargonium species in the context of bioprospecting and conservation. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. And that again underlines that there are much more than just monetary benefits coming out of ABS. I would like to thank you now at the level of the panel discussion, but I do see that there are a couple of questions being raised by the audience. And here I would now hand over to, I believe, Valerie and Julia to maybe address some of these questions or hand them over to the panelists. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Suhail. So yes, we have received quite a number of interesting questions during the panel. And we have about 5 minutes left for questions. So I think the first one, which is quite a high-level question, but is quite interesting, is addressed to all of the panelists. So perhaps I will ask perhaps Keivan and Ulrich to share their thoughts on this. And this is about how you envision the role of the private sector with regards to ABS in terms of balancing ecological impact with business outcomes. So how do you, what is your perspective on this? Because of course, this can be a challenge. So perhaps Keivan, if you want to start.
Yeah, I can start. Very good question. And I think by the end, I think that we can address one of the topics that I was not able to cover by the 2 rounds, is that how the business sectors can try to enhance the cultural aspect. So normally when we are talking about biodiversity, we have some properties and we have the traditional knowledge used by the local population. So one of the things and one of the contributions that the private sector can give is how we can try to give the value, the property value, and also to distribute these cultural aspects and doing this in a way that we can guarantee the sustainable source. So I think that the both contribution should be how we can enhance the traditional knowledge at the same time that we can guarantee that when we have the sources of those raw materials, we do that in a sustainable way.
Thank you, Kevin. And now, Ulrich, do you have some thoughts on that? How to balance basically ecological impact with business outcomes? How to have a win-win situation? How can you achieve that?
Yeah, thank you. I would say this is a piece of work in progress. I think the implementation of ABS is now a good 10 years old. In South Africa, a little bit longer because we started in 2008. So the work that we have been doing also together with the department and the community's focuses on certain things, you become good at it, and then you sort of ask yourself what else can be done, and other aspects do come in. And each case is also very, very different. I think in the case of Natura, where there is one company utilizing a number of resources, is very different from the case of Pelargonium, where there's a pharmaceutical company which, for instance, cannot utilize the work that is done, or the good work that is done in their advertising, because you can't advertise pharmaceutical products with community, with pictures from the community. So it's a very different world. However, I think as I said, it's work in progress. We certainly are focusing more and more also on balancing, on bringing development into the communities, trying to utilize the resources more and more sustainably. The resource assessments were mentioned by Lactitia, which gives everybody, the regulators, the nature conservation authorities, the industry, a lot more knowledge of what is available, how to manage it best, and to make it sustainable. So there is, I see it as work in progress. Lots to be done still. And yeah, we need to focus more on that.
Okay, thank you, Ulrich. And Keivan, perhaps one last question for you, because we're running out of time. There were questions specifically about the benefit sharing fund. The first question is whether there is a legal framework for the management of the fund. And there was another question related to the financial support from government, whether you receive Natura government support from government to sustain your employees who are involved in working with communities. So if you can maybe quickly say a few words about that.
Yeah, so just regarding the fund, just not to make any kind of confusion, because the new genetic heritage legislation that we have in Brazil in place by 2015, there is the national fund on ABS. We are not talking about that. We are talking about, let's say, a voluntary fund that we create by the previous legislation. So we do not have any template. It's something that is managed by the business, the communities, and of course, we have some representatives from the government. So it's totally different. I think that one of the main contributions that we have is how we can educate and how we can teach the communities to use the benefit sharing payments in a way that can benefit more projects and development better the infrastructure and the supply chains in the region. Regarding the second question, what it was, Valerie, sorry? The second part?
About whether you've received financial support from the government.
No, we do not receive. Basically, what we have is that they are part just by the mutual agreed terms with the communities.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much to all the panelists for your useful contributions. It is now time to move to the concluding remarks. So I will ask you to please turn your cameras off and to mute yourself. But again, thank you very much to all of you. And now I would like to invite Taukonjo Chikongo, who is the head of the Nagoya Protocol Unit at the CBD Secretariat, share with us some concluding remarks.
Well, Valerie, thank you. Good morning and good afternoon to all. It has been indeed a very interesting and insightful webinar that takes stock of quite an interesting process. And what is clear is that for sustainable development to be achieved, it is crucial that we harmonize three core elements, which are economic growth, social inclusion, and environmental protection. And these elements, as is being highlighted, are interconnected and are crucial for the well-being of individuals and societies. It was also noteworthy to see that the word culture has featured, because in the end, the culture is what sustains what we do. And what we are looking for through all this is social and policy or political change to achieve the desired outcomes as articulated in the SDGs. And as you said earlier, Valerie, it is about a paradigm shift in stakeholders. And I think what this project has highlighted is that in monitoring whether we are achieving this, we have to see whether the preconditions that are necessary and collectively sufficient to reach the long-term ABS outcomes and ultimate desired impact are present. And in some of the cases, it's been there, and some of them, it's not been there. And that then point to the fact that we need to ask ourselves, is the contribution of ABS to the DGGs plausible? And we have to look then also whether we are realistic with our long-term goals as outlined in the SDGs, and are they feasible? And are there solid and measurable indicators that can test the contribution of ABS to achieve the SDGs? And will they yield sufficient information to evaluate the success of what we have undertaken? And will that be convincing to the necessary audiences? Because we are being asked, Nagoya Protocol has been there for 10 years. What has it achieved? And are there real practical cases out there? And we can see from this process that the methodologies and outcome of this project can assist us in the ongoing framework within which social change will be engineered through the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. And what we can see, or what we have learned through this project, is that the core SDGs from SDG 1 to 7 are being addressed and through ABS, and through that, the sub-themes. I won't go into the SDGs that have been addressed, as they've been spoken about quite eloquently already. I'll just sort of zoom in into what is the learning that has come out of the following, listening to all the speakers. What comes to mind is that we need to continue advancing in implementation of ABS at all levels, as this will then enhance legal certainty for all of us. And it is important for us to share experiences and highlight success stories on ABS that we all can then learn from. We have now heard from Asia, we have heard from Africa, we have heard from Latin America. What's the experience with the other regions, Europe and the Pacific, Caribbean, etc.? And it is also important that, as what was just discussed now, that the private sector need to provide feedback on how to make ABS work and create a win-win situation for all of us. And we all need to move beyond looking to ABS in isolation or as a legal requirement towards starting to see ABS as a tool to contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals, thus elevating ABS to the position that it needs. And we are grateful that we now have the compendium that contains all the lessons learned and experiences. And this new body of knowledge is actually managing the ABS knowledge and experiences that we have gathered over these 10 years, noting that some of the work has been there for longer than the existence of the Nagoya Protocol. And so moving towards the concluding, as a Secretariat, we would like to thank all those that were involved in this partnership or this collaboration and that made all this possible, notably the German Ministry of Environment and Nuclear Safety, the Federal Agency of Nature Conservation, the Union for Ethical Power Trade, Geomedia, and the Institute for Biodiversity Networks. But also, we must not forget the communities in Africa, Latin America, and Asia who have been involved in helping us to generate this body of knowledge. Finally, also a great thanks to all of you, the participants. May we become the change that we want to see in the world towards a healthy planet, healthy people, healthy life support systems, and assurance of the continuous positive evolution of life on Earth. Thank you.
Dear Taco, thank you for these concluding remarks, for sharing your wisdom and providing some food for further thought. It is now time to close the webinar. I wish to thank all of the speakers, panelists, and participants for your participation today. And as you know, at UEBT, we also have ABS resources online, so please feel free to look at the UEBT website. So I wish you a great rest of the day, and thank you again for your participation. All the best.